Some of you might know that one of the great atheists of the 20th century was a man named Antony Flew. You might not know that his dad was a Methodist minister, and that Antony, he served in World War II for the British Royal Air Force. And it was actually out of that, if you were with us on Friday, that you might find this connection interesting. It was out of that experience in World War II that he saw the devastation of death, and he saw the extent of evil in the world, and he said, there is no God. And he largely spent much of his life, after World War II, he went and studied at St. John's College in Oxford, and then he taught philosophy at the University of St. Andrews and University of Reading, and I think another university in Great Britain, in England. But he spent a lot of his life arguing against the existence of God. In fact, he gave a lecture once, presented a paper to the Socratic Society in Oxford at the time in which actually C.S. Lewis, the great Christian apologist, was presiding over that society, titled Theology and Falsification. He spent a lot of his time arguing, as part of a lot of his life, arguing against the idea of God. And yet in 2004, right near the end of his life, he was 81 years old. He said, I've been wrong all along. And then, when 3 years later, when he was 84, he actually co-wrote a book called There Is a God: How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. I'll say this, that he sadly actually did not confess Jesus. And the argument that he found so compelling was the idea that the world as it is could never have by chance happened. A lot of DNA research was happening, and that kind of turned it for him. There must be a God. But this, he said, the evidence for the resurrection is better than any claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. The current Yale professor of finance, James Choi, maybe you read this, recently published an article actually on Yale's website titled, Why I'm a Christian. Children, just do this for a moment. Even though I don't believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or the Tooth Fairy. Okay, kids, you can unstop your ears. His entire argument is the veracity of the resurrection. His whole argument is this has to have happened. There's a greater argument for this than, he goes on to say, all these mathematical proofs that we take as givens. I told you this a few years back, but I want to tell you this again. On Saturday, June 17th, in 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. There was a security guard. This is an interesting detail. There was a security guard that found that there were these doors that had been taped, and so that you could try to lock them and shut them, but they would remain open. And so he took off this tape, just thinking that's really weird and sketchy. But then he made his way back around near the end of the day, and the tape was back on. Of course, he called the police, and an unmarked police car arrived. While the person who was supposed to be looking out for these burglars in this office building was distracted by watching TV across the street. So these 5 men were arrested, and they were convicted of conspiracy, burglary, attempted wiretapping. That's all scandalous in and of itself. But the real scandal happened when the President of the United States, who was Richard Nixon, and the committee that was supposed to be helping him get reelected, was found to be behind all of it. The president himself. Scandal and deception and lies. The stuff that makes up great movies. And of course, that event was known as Watergate, right? And one of these president's men was known as Nixon's hatchet man, and his name was Chuck Colson, who many of you have probably met, or not met, but you've heard of him. So this is what he says. He later gave his life to Jesus, actually reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. But this is what he said about the resurrection. I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Every one of them was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. Absolutely impossible. The resurrection has been a thing throughout time again and again and again that have changed hardened atheists, absolute skeptics, the world's greatest doubters into people that have given their lives to Jesus over and over and over again. So the question is, what does Easter make of you? What's the resurrection make of you? I mean, do you think of it as a cover-up? An Easter gate? Is it a self-producing, reinforcing just lie that people have bought into again and again and again? A cover-up put together by Jesus' disciples to dupe those Roman authorities, to hoodwink the religious leaders, to delude disciples all through these many years. Some Easter gate. What's Easter do to you? We have 3 narratives here, and I love that these narratives are all put together because there's a sort of a movement that happens, and there's an individuality that takes place, and there's a movement towards the sorrow and the sadness of a lost loved one, the doubt that God is even real and possibly could do things that you would hope for, and fear. And Easter speaks to all those kinds of things. Let's take these accounts from the end back to the beginning. So first, Thomas. What's Thomas's nickname? Doubting Thomas, right? And I just think Thomas actually acts sort of how we would expect him to act. Like Thomas kind of gets a bad rap, but I think that most of us would actually put ourselves right where Thomas found himself. Thomas doesn't appear that much in the gospel narratives. Of course, you learn a lot about the disciple Peter. James and John get mentioned quite a bit, but Thomas isn't mentioned too terribly much. And when we do find Thomas, we look at him and we kind of think he seems rather dour. He's somewhat of a difficult disciple. There's only a couple times where he's really mentioned. One in the Gospel of John is in chapter 11, and he more or less says this. Well, if we're going to go with Jesus, let's go. Chapter 14, he kind of tells Jesus this. And probably you've had this experience when you're reading the Gospels and you want to say the same thing that Thomas basically says. He says, Lord, your teaching isn't very clear. And so on that first Easter day, Thomas isn't with the other disciples. It's kind of wild. Like they're all together, but Thomas isn't among them. Maybe he'd think about this. Maybe he'd already thought, I'm going to throw in the towel. I've been following this guy for 3 long years of my life. And I was, I don't know that he was there, but he likely was in that crowd. We shout and crucify him. And maybe he was lining the streets of Jerusalem as Jesus carried his cross. And maybe he saw him hanging on that cross. And Thomas thought, I've had enough. I've been dragged along too long. I've been duped with this grandiose story of God in the flesh and all that. Forget it. He knew, like you and I do, that dead people stay dead. They do. In the Gospel of John, and this is through the Gospels, there's some people that are really hostile to Jesus. We've seen some of this recently, actually, as we've looked at the Gospel of Luke. They're mostly religious leaders. plotting his demise. Of course, there's the crowd that cheers his death. There are a lot of people who misunderstand Jesus. People that threw palm branches down as he entered into Jerusalem. And they were saying, Hosanna, and they wanted him to be like a king that could overthrow the Romans. And those two kinds of people still, of course, exist today. People that are just hostile, and people that misunderstand. But then there's Thomas, and there's tons of Thomases too, right? And maybe you find yourself like Thomas. What do you do with a God who comes to heal, who comes to forgive, who comes to restore, who comes to liberate, who raises from the dead? I mean, my guess is a lot, just doubt. That's too much to take on. That's impossible. God can't do those things if this whole God thing is real anyway. What I'm suggesting to you is that Thomas, though he gets a bad rap, is not too far from us. He's not. He's really not. Some of you know Rowan Williams, the last Archbishop of Canterbury. He's a great writer. He wrote this: "Death and the hells of dereliction and abandonment eat people up." Think of Anthony Flew, having come back from World War II. He said, it's enough. Give it up. Rowan Williams says, it exhausts them. It scrapes them out, and it brings them to nothing. And I think Thomas had a sense of this, and my guess is many of you do too. Maybe death has come close. Maybe death through sort of loss has come close to broken hearts, broken relationships, bodies that don't work, minds that just are so confused. Sin that persists, just death in the world, and it scrapes you out. It leaves you hollow, and it leaves you absolutely full of doubt. Doubt and resurrection and life after all of this loss. So it makes us wonder if Easter is sort of an Eastergate kind of thing, a cover-up. Was it something that was a dream? And that's what Thomas is kind of saying. This can't happen. There's no way. A hallucination. Maybe what some people think is resurrection happened in the hearts of the disciples.